Welcome back, everyone, to another spine-tingling episode. Today, we're delving into the terrifying truth behind 3 pet sitter horror stories, where the seemingly innocent task of looking after a pet turns into something far more sinister. These stories may make you think twice before you agree to pet sit for a friend. Before we jump into these eerie tales, I want to thank all of you for your continued support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions mean so much to us, and it's because of you that we can keep bringing you these terrifying stories. Stay safe, take care of yourselves, and get ready for a journey into the darker side of pet sitting. Let's begin. Story 1: The Haunted Dog Sitting Call. I have always found the nights, especially those that stretch into the small hours, to be the most suffocating. This particular night, however, the weight of that suffocation pressed against me more heavily than it had in a long time. It was the kind of stillness that permeates a house after dark, the kind where the ticking of a clock sounds more like a countdown, reminding you that time, that constant and cruel presence, never stops. Mrs. Henderson's house had that kind of stillness, the kind that lingers, that clings to the walls like dust. We were 3 high school friends, Lucy, Emma, and I, left to dog sit for Mrs. Henderson over the weekend while she was away. It seemed like a simple enough request. I'd never thought much of it. Mrs. Henderson, with her odd assortment of antiques and old photographs that seemed to watch you as you moved about, was harmless enough in her way. She had given us a list of instructions for Buster, her golden retriever, who was usually calm, though she did warn us he could get a bit agitated if anything strange happens. Then, I don't know why, but those words stuck with me. Maybe it was the way she said them, so casually as if nothing in this world were stranger than the quiet, suburban life she led. But as we sat in her dimly lit living room, with the storm raging outside and Buster curled up by the fireplace, those words echoed in my mind, growing heavier with each passing minute. "I don't like this place," Emma muttered, more to herself than anyone else, but I heard it. I think we all did. We were all uneasy, though none of us would admit it out loud. We laughed it off, of course, as any group of teenagers would. We played cards, drank soda, flipped through channels on the TV, anything to distract ourselves from the growing discomfort that pressed against us from all sides. The house was too quiet. The house was too big. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the haze of idle chatter and rain pounding against the windows. Lucy grabbed her phone, glancing at the caller ID. Her face tightened. "It's a local number," she said, her voice betraying the confusion that was creeping into all of us. She answered it. I'll never forget the sound of that voice. Distorted, broken, as though it had been filtered through some kind of static-filled barrier, making every word seem alien, foreign. It crackled, but through the distortion, it was clear we found Mrs. Henderson's wallet. "It's at the gas station down the road. You need to come pick it up." Lucy frowned, holding the phone away from her ear as though she could somehow distance herself from the strange urgency of the words. It didn't make sense. Mrs. Henderson had left with her wallet, hadn't she? I was sure she had. "Mrs. Henderson didn't forget her wallet," Emma said, almost to herself. She had been listening intently, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Where exactly is this gas station?" Lucy asked, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it now, a tone that suggested she, too, felt something unsettling in the air. The caller was evasive, the voice now almost frantic, urging her to hurry. "It's urgent. You need to come now." There was something deeply wrong about it, but Lucy hung up, her face pale, as if the weight of the conversation had drained the color from her. "We're not going anywhere," Emma said firmly, her hand gripping her phone with white knuckles. That was strange. I nodded, though a knot had formed in my stomach. The sense of unease that had been creeping over us since we arrived at the house had now solidified into something much worse. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the storm. There was something outside, something reaching in. The phone rang again before we could even speak, and this time, none of us wanted Lucy to pick it up. "Don't answer it," I said, though my voice cracked with uncertainty. But of course Lucy did. She wasn't one to shy away from confrontation, even if the confrontation was with something unknown, something that lurked just beyond the surface. The voice was even worse this time, more insistent, more demanding. "You need to leave the house," it hissed through the static, as though it could reach into the very marrow of her bones and twist them. "Now." Lucy hung up again, shaking her head in disbelief. "That's it. I'm calling Mrs. Henderson." But before she could, the phone rang a third time. Same number. Same distortion. "Don't pick it up," I said again, my voice trembling now, though I hated myself for showing it. We all stood in that moment, each of us holding our breath, wondering if we had already crossed some threshold we couldn't return from. I looked at Emma and saw that she was holding her breath too, her fingers trembling as she clutched her phone, like it might somehow protect her. "I don't think we should answer it again," Emma whispered, her voice small as though speaking too loudly might summon something we were not prepared to face. But before we could make any decision, the house seemed to shift. Buster, who had been laying quietly by the fire, stood up with a growl deep in his throat, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very depths of him. His ears were flat against his head, his body tense. "I'm going to check on him," Tyler said, his voice strained but determined. I could tell he was trying to force normalcy, but it wasn't working. The air felt charged with an invisible pressure, a weight that was slowly bearing down on us. The kitchen door stood ajar, and as Tyler crossed the threshold, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the faint outline of a figure in the corner of the room. The light quivered in his hand, casting jagged shadows that seemed to twitch, alive with some unnatural energy. There, in the dim glow, stood a figure, a tall, thin silhouette, its features obscured by the darkness. It moved with an unnerving calmness, sifting through the cabinets with a deliberate slowness, as though the act itself were a ritual, something practiced over and over in the dark spaces between worlds. I froze. We all did. And then, as if sensing our presence, the figure turned, its head tilting slightly, as though it had been expecting us all along. It made no move to flee, no sudden startle or attempt to escape, as though it had no need to run. Instead, it simply turned away and walked toward the back of the house, through the sunroom and out the door into the night, leaving us in a stunned silence that clung to us like a shroud. None of us moved for a long time. None of us dared. Finally, Lucy was the first to react, bolting to the door to lock it, but the fear lingered. The house, which had been unsettling before, now felt like something alien, something we didn't belong to. "I'll call the police," Lucy said, her voice hoarse as she fumbled for her phone. But we all knew it wouldn't matter. The police would come, as they always do, but it wouldn't change anything. It couldn't. By the time they arrived, the storm had begun to subside, leaving behind a silence even deeper than before. The officers searched the house, each room, every corner, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. The house was still. Empty. The doors were all locked, except for the back one, which we had not noticed had been left ajar. "We think it might have been a burglar," one of the officers suggested, though there was a hesitation in his voice. "Maybe someone who got in before you arrived." But that didn't explain the figure's calmness. The stillness. The way it had seemed to wait for us, as if it had known we were coming, as if it had always been there. Later, as we wandered through the house, we saw the subtle signs of its intrusion: drawers left open, cabinets carelessly rummaged through. But nothing was missing. Not a thing. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had all been some strange intrusion into our reality, a crack in the fabric of our world that had allowed something ... or to slip through. The calls, the figure, the house. We never found out who had called or why they had been so insistent. We never found out who the figure was or what it wanted. But we knew deep in our bones that something had been watching us, waiting for us. And perhaps, just perhaps, it still was. Story to a house-sitting nightmare. There are some experiences that, no matter how much time passes, never truly fade. They linger dormant, buried beneath the ordinary routine of life. But they never leave you. My time spent house-sitting for the Greeley family, though brief in the grand scheme of things, has left an indelible mark. For years I have told myself that it was nothing, that the events which unfolded in that house were merely the products of an overactive imagination, heightened by isolation and a mind preoccupied with studies and stress. And yet late at night, when the world grows still and quiet, I can feel it again, that inexplicable sense of wrongness, as though something has followed me from that place, something that continues to watch from the corners of my life, unseen but ever present. I had been house-sitting for the Greeleys for as long as I could remember. They were an older couple, wealthy in that effortless way that came from generations of well-kept investments, their lives filled with European vacations, country clubs, and charity galas. The Greeley house was as grand as their lifestyle, the sprawling two-story colonial on the outskirts of town, set far back from the road, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to press in on all sides, isolating it even further from the world. It was a place that, even on the sunniest days, seemed cast in perpetual shadow. The windows, tall and narrow, were always covered by heavy curtains, the kind that never fully opened, leaving the rooms in a state of semi-darkness, as though the house itself was reluctant to reveal too much. The first few times I stayed there, I didn't think much of it. The house was quiet, certainly, and a bit unnerving in its stillness, but I chalked that up to its size and my own discomfort with being alone in such a large, empty space. It wasn't unusual for me to hear the occasional creak or groan from the floorboards as the house settled, nor was it strange to feel a draft or see the curtains shift ever so slightly in the night. I told myself it was all perfectly normal, just an old house full of old quirks. But as the years went on and my stays at the Greeleys became more frequent, I began to notice things. Small things at first, little oddities that I could easily brush aside. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here than they did elsewhere, pooling in the corners of rooms, refusing to disperse even when I flipped on the lights. The air, too, always felt thick, almost suffocating, especially after dark, as though the house itself was holding its breath. And then there were the cats, 4 of them, all sleek and black, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. They were the Greeleys' pride and joy, and they treated them with more affection than they showed toward most humans. The cats, too, were strange, though. They moved silently through the house, appearing and disappearing without a sound, always watching, always lurking just out of sight. I would often catch one of them staring at me from across the room, its eyes wide and unblinking, as though it knew something I didn't. Despite these small discomforts, I never felt truly afraid in the house until my junior year of college, when I agreed to stay for 2 weeks while the Greeleys took one of their extended trips to Europe. But from the moment I arrived, I could tell something was different. The house felt wrong in a way that I couldn't quite explain. It was as though the air itself had changed, grown heavier, thicker. The familiar creaks of the floorboards seemed louder, more deliberate, as though something was moving just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. On the second night it began. I was sitting in the living room, trying to focus on a book, when the TV turned on by itself. The sudden burst of static filled the room with a harsh, crackling light, cutting through the silence like a knife. For a moment I just sat there, staring at the screen in confusion. The remote was on the coffee table, untouched. I reached for it, my hand shaking slightly, and turned the TV off. The static faded, and the room was quiet again. But something had changed. The silence was no longer comforting, it was oppressive. as though the house had been holding its breath and was now waiting for me to make the next move. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A faulty remote, a glitch in the system. There were a dozen rational explanations, but none of them felt right. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaks and groans, the faint rustle of curtains in the breeze, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Not from the windows or the door, but from within the walls themselves. Over the next few nights, the TV continued to turn on by itself, always to the same static-filled channel. No matter how many times I turned it off, it would flicker back to life, filling the room with that strange, flickering light. I began to feel like the house was playing a game with me, testing my resolve, pushing me to see how far I would go before I broke. Each time the TV turned on, the static seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as though it was trying to communicate something I couldn't quite hear. Daniel, my boyfriend, came over a few times during those first few days. He hated the house, always had. I could see the tension in his face the moment he walked through the door, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as though he was trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. He told me that the house felt off, that there was something about it that made his skin crawl. I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't deny that I felt it too. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of something lurking just out of sight, waiting. One night we were sitting in the living room, watching a movie, when the cats began acting strangely. They were normally aloof, independent creatures, but now they were darting from room to room, their tails puffed up, their eyes wide. They wouldn't come near us, and more than once, I caught them staring at the basement door as though something was on the other side. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a baby's cry, coming from beneath us. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more distinct, until there was no mistaking it. Daniel looked at me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's probably one of the cats," I said, though I knew even as I spoke that it wasn't. The cats were all in the room with us, huddled together on the far side of the couch, their eyes fixed on the basement door. Daniel shook his head. "That wasn't a cat." I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay put, to ignore the sound, to leave the house and never come back. But something, a mixture of pride and fear, pushed me toward the basement door. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs, my hand gripping the railing so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The basement was colder than I remembered, the air damp and heavy. The single light bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows across the piles of old furniture and boxes that filled the space. The crying had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt thick, suffocating, as though the house was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I checked every corner, every shadow. There was nothing, no sign of any cats, no sign of anything that could have made that sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something just out of sight, hiding in the darkness, watching. When I went back upstairs, Daniel was waiting for me, his face pale. The cats were still huddled together in the living room, their eyes wide and frightened. None of them had gone downstairs. Whatever had made that sound, it wasn't one of them. The next few days were worse. The TV continued to turn itself on, always to that same static-filled channel. The creaking footsteps I had once dismissed as the house settling grew louder, more deliberate, as though something was pacing the floors just out of sight. I began to notice other things, too. Doors that I knew I had closed were left ajar when I returned to the room. Objects seemed to move on their own, shifting ever so slightly when I wasn't looking. The cats, normally aloof and independent, refused to leave my side. They followed me from room to room, their eyes constantly darting toward the basement door, as though they could sense something I couldn't. Then, the night before the Greeleys were due to return, I heard the cry again. This time it was louder, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from beneath the floorboards in my bedroom. I lay there frozen, too terrified to move, as the sound grew louder and closer, until it felt like whatever was making it was just beneath me, crawling through the walls. I don't remember how I got through that night. I must have fallen asleep eventually, though I can't recall when. When I woke the next morning, the house was quiet again. The Greeleys returned later that day, cheerful and oblivious, and I handed over the keys without a word. I've never told anyone what happened in that house. Not the full story, anyway. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that faint, distant cry, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. Story 3: Veterinary Assistant Pet Sitting Incident. The stillness of the house was no longer a comfort, but an affliction. It stretched around me, oppressively thick, a blanket of silence that smothered every attempt to think clearly. My feet shuffled across the cold wooden floor, each step a distant thud in the cavernous emptiness of the house. The walls themselves seemed to lean inward, their silent breath rattling the windows. I wanted to flee to leave this place and never return, but I could not bring myself to move. Ringo's voice echoed in my mind, repeating those words, "Don't go up there." I had no reason to listen. It was a parrot, a bird whose simple mind had no concept of the danger it warned of. But there was something about the way it spoke. The tone was not that of a pet repeating learned phrases, it was deliberate, cold, human. I could feel something watching me. The sensation crawled over my skin like the brush of 1,000 unseen eyes. Something was out of place, not just in the house, but in the very air I breathed. The shadows in the hallway thickened, as if gathering themselves into shapes that were too fluid, too uncertain to define. As I made my way toward the staircase, the subtle but unmistakable shift in the air tugged at my senses, as if the house itself were moving, rearranging its bones and sinews around me. The stairs loomed before me, an ascent into a darkness I knew better than to confront. And yet, against the deep pit of instinct that warned me to turn back, I found my feet moving toward them. The voice of Ringo had ceased, but its presence lingered in the air like the oppressive weight of a secret that had been revealed too late. "Don't go up there." The warning echoed in my head, a drumbeat, incessant, relentless. I paused at the foot of the stairs, my body trembling with an impulse I could not suppress. It was then that I realized I was no longer alone. The cat. Salem. It had returned, though not with the calm indifference it had shown earlier. It stood in the hallway, staring at me with eyes that were wide and gleaming with something that could only be described as terror. Its body was rigid, poised as though ready to flee at a moment's notice. The fur on its back was bristled, its tail flicking in anxious bursts. It watched me with an intensity that felt almost accusatory, as though it blamed me for the events that were unfolding, for the things I had allowed to happen. I wanted to call to it, to comfort it, but I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my voice a faint rasp in the silence. I had the distinct impression that to speak to break the silence would be to shatter the fragile equilibrium of the moment, to let in whatever it was that had begun to take root in the house. And so I stood there, paralyzed, my eyes locked with Salem's, my mind reeling with a dozen different thoughts that refused to make sense. The air around me felt heavier now, as though something unseen was pressing in from all sides. The house had become a living thing, breathing slowly, deliberately, as though it were considering its next move. I could feel the weight of its intentions, feel its gaze, but I could not perceive it clearly. It was as though I were on the verge of understanding something, some horrific, incomprehensible truth, but the details eluded me, slipping just beyond my grasp, like a dream fading as soon as I opened my eyes. I should have turned back. I should have fled the house, left the animals to their fates, and never looked back. But the pull was too strong, the urge to understand what was happening, to discover the truth, even if it shattered everything I thought I knew about myself and the world. Salem remained frozen, its gaze unwavering. The darkness above me deepened, spreading like ink across the page of a story I had not yet finished reading. And then, from somewhere beyond the shadows, I heard it. As a sound. Chode. A whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was the voice of a man, or something close to it. It came from above, from the forbidden upstairs rooms. I could not make out the words, but the tone was one I recognized, distant, hollow, like a memory forgotten for too long. It was the sound of someone calling out, but not with any sense of urgency or fear. No, it was the voice of someone resigned to the inevitable, a voice that had known defeat long before it spoke. And then, as I stood there, the house seemed to shift again, a faint crackle in the air, a subtle change in the weight of the atmosphere, and I realized with a shock of icy terror that the upstairs rooms were no longer just off limits. They had become something else entirely, something forbidden. The whispering voice grew louder. It no longer seemed to come from above me, but from within the very walls. It was as if the house itself had opened up to speak to me, to offer me a message I could not bear to hear. Do not go up there. This time the voice was clearer, but it did not come from Ringo. It did not come from any living thing. It was something else, something that had existed in the house far longer than I had, something that had been waiting. The sensation of being watched intensified. The shadows around me had deepened, and now they seemed to gather at the top of the stairs, coalescing into figures that moved just beyond the threshold of my perception. I could not see them, but I could feel them, pressing in on me from all sides. They were not human, but they were there. I wanted to call out, to demand that the house explain itself. But I knew better. It would not answer. It was not capable of answering. It had no intention of explaining itself to me. This house, this place did not belong to me. It belonged to something else. Something older, something that had always been here. I turned to look at Salem. The cat had not moved. Its eyes remained locked on mine, but its expression had shifted. It was no longer just a creature of instinct. It was something else entirely, something trapped, something aware. And then, without warning, the parrot spoke again. Ringo's voice was louder now, more insistent, its words clear and sharp. Don't go up there. Don't you understand? The words echoed in the house, bouncing off the walls, reverberating in my skull. I could no longer ignore them. The dread I had felt earlier had taken on a tangible form, a weight that pressed against my chest, suffocating me. So the house was alive, and it was waiting. I couldn't stay any longer. I had to leave. But when I turned toward the door, my gaze was drawn once more to the stairs. The shadows at the top were darker than I had ever seen them, moving like things with minds of their own. I could feel them stretching toward me, hungry for my fear. I stepped back. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned away from the stairs. But as I did, I heard it. A sound low and soft like the scuffling of feet, or something worse, something far older. The whispering had stopped, but the air remained thick with something unspeakable. I had heard enough. The house had spoken its truth, and I had no desire to uncover any more. But as I reached for the door, my hand froze. The cat, Salem, was no longer at the foot of the stairs. It was standing by the door, its eyes fixed on me, but now there was no sign of recognition in them. There was nothing but darkness. I opened the door, and for a moment I thought I heard it again, Ringo's voice. The last words it would ever speak. Don't go up there. But this time I wasn't sure if it was the parrot or something else altogether. The house had already claimed its own. And with that, we come to the end of today's terrifying journey into the dark secrets behind 3 terrifying high school horror stories. I hope these stories left you with a chill down your spine. as they reveal just how dark the halls of high schools can truly be. We want to thank you all for your incredible support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions keep us going. We couldn't do it without you. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the darkest secrets are hidden in plain sight. We hope you'll join us again for more unsettling tales in the next video. Until then, take care of yourselves and don't forget to check over your shoulder. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. See you next time.